Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, depending on where you are in the world today. Thank you for attending Versa Network's software-defined webinar series, where today the presentation is about do-it-yourself or managed SD-WAN. But before we get into the presentation, I want to very quickly go through some general logistics regarding the webinar. If you have any questions, of course, please leverage the Ask a Question button located on the top left-hand side of your player. We'll actually get through your questions potentially during the actual session itself, but most likely we're going to hold them toward the end. We've attached a number of resources for all of you, a case study, joint case study between us as well as the other participant on our webinar, our partner, SNET Communications, a copy of the presentation, a quick at-a-glance document, as well as some website pointers to actually learn a little bit more information after the webinar's conclusion. As a reminder, please rate the webinar at the conclusion. And at the end, this webinar will be available on demand, and you can leverage the exact same link that you used to view it today. And with that, I'd like to get started. My name is Robert McBride. I'm with Versa Networks, and I'm a Director of Enterprise and Telco Solutions. And I'm glad to have Mike Hensgen of SNET Communications, who's the Director of Sales. Mike, say hello.
Yes, good morning to everybody. I'm glad to be here, and thank you to everyone for participating this morning.
Awesome. So, as we said, the title today is going to be Do-It-Yourself or Managed SD-WAN. Myself from Versa will be covering the topic around Do-It-Yourself, and our partner from SNET, Mike Hensgen, will be covering the managed topic. To kind of give a quick review really fast for everybody so you understand the various different topics we want to go through with you today, we're going to introduce our partner, SNET Communications, so you can understand who they are and what services they offer. Then I'm going to go very, very quickly into SD-WAN as we make an assumption that most of our attendees today know what SD-WAN is, some of the various different technical aspects associated to it, but I just want to give some quick highlights into either motivators or purposes or various different reasons why customers, enterprises, service providers, if you will, may actually want to deploy SD-WAN. And then we're going to talk about really quick, how do you actually consume it? And then from consumption, then we talk about deployment. And then from deployment to the meat of our topic today, which is really going to be about, do you do it yourself or do you actually go to a managed service provider? And we're going to kind of give some comparisons, some food for thought for you as far as what you need to consider into, if I want to do it with DIY, what do I need to think about? What am I responsible for? If I go managed, what am I not responsible for? And potentially some of the pros and cons between both. And with that, you'll hear some stories about some customer case studies on both fronts, and then we'll open it up for question and answer. And with that, I'd like to kick it off to Mike Hensgen first to kind of give an introduction on who is SNET.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Rob. So SNET is a boutique cloud solutions provider established a little over 10 years ago. The founders of our company were responsible for the voice and data networks of two very large companies that the majority of our participants have probably heard of. McDonald's and PepsiCo. So we have vast knowledge in not only advanced networking, but also voice applications. Here at SNET, our focus is on SD-WAN with next generation firewall, cloud-based PBX solutions, and enterprise cloud-based call centers. And although we're headquartered in Chicago, we have nearly 35,000 seats on our cloud-based PBX and over 300 Versa SD-WAN deployments nationwide.
Great, Rob. Mike. Yeah. So, SNET's done a lot of deployments for us, as you see, over 300 current deployments to date. As Mike has stated, it's nationwide. And, you'll see some interesting things as he talks about from, it's not just SD-WAN, right? They're utilizing SD-WAN to help drive some of their voice and UC business. So to kind of apropos to the topic I'm about to bring up, which is, why SD-WAN? And, as you see the tagline here, the idea is, a lot of businesses across the globe are recognizing that the WAN and branch fundamentally need to change, just simply because there's a lot of stuff going on, technologically. We hear the buzzwords of like digital transformation and modernization and such, right? But the truth of the matter is, the way in how applications are serving our users or where we're hosting them, how we're actually serving our actual consumers or business partners has fundamentally changed. And the WAN just isn't set up to be able to serve that properly. And we look at four various different broad kind of categories, right? I'm not even talking about, some of the inherent, technical value and benefits that SD-WAN provides, but, there's four broad things you can look at. Why do you want to change the WAN of the branch? Well, you need to grow your business. With the current way that most WAN architectures are structured, it's very difficult to be able to grow your business from a site footprint at a very cost-effective manner. And so SD-WAN comes into play in order to be able to more easily consume things like hybrid WAN, right? Deploying LTE services for very remote sites, looking at different types of transport options, broadband or direct internet access in order to get higher bandwidth at a better cost per megabit per second value. Being able to deploy them much easier. One of the other things is, in my years in working as installation and marketing and product management and such across a variety of different groups, and very specifically here at Versa, one of the things you hear a lot is it just takes too long to install, right? You're looking at 30 to 90 days in most cases for some businesses. Moving on, we look at transformative user experience. What this really is the fact that, many of you here on the call are likely Office 365 users, right? And so that experience of utilizing more of a SaaS-based type of an application to drive your business or productivity purposes, right? That experience is impacted as a result of the way the WAN connectivity is set up, right? Is it enough bandwidth? Is it optimized? Can you actually make sure you're intelligently able to detect that this is a SaaS application for your users, and how do you actually get it to the provider quickly? And so those are things that are inherent within SD-WAN and are motivators to actually look at SD-WAN as a solution to change your WAN and branch. Modernization, we have some government customers on the Versa side where they aren't necessarily looking at wanting to do, active hybrid WAN or, looking at doing application intelligence as a motivator. They're just looking at modernization, moving away from our traditional stacked hierarchy of appliances and trying to do some level of appliance consolidation, from connectivity as well as security. And then obviously regulatory and policy compliance, right? This is a really big one. Whether you're a financial customer, military, DoD, government, every vertical has some sort of regulatory or policy that they must adhere to. And it's very difficult to be able to very quickly manage change control as policies change, as new threats hit up on the landscape or the horizon. And more importantly, as you look at different ways to serve consumers or business partners, there's a lot of more guest-tenant type of networking going on, right? Different partner clouds or different partner presences. And so now you need to start looking at different ways to kind of, how do I segment my networks without building up air gaps, right? I don't want to build up multiple siloed networks and such. And so this is another motivator why people look at SD-WAN for the inherent, per segment encryption, different types of topologies, simplicity of assigning security and service chaining that can actually happen with these types of solutions. So in summary, if you look at it just at a high level, you got growth, experience, modernization, and functionally compliance can be four big motivators for enterprise businesses to actually look at wanting to change their WAN. And quite frankly, SD-WAN is, top of the choices, if you will, or top of mind of many IT operators and decision makers, if you will, today. Moving forward, kind of funny here, right? So like I said, there's a lot of folks that I want to change my WAN and branch, and what do I do? Well, SD-WAN is coming up a lot in those conversations, and so let's make an assumption that you drank the Kool-Aid, right? You looked at SD-WAN, it says, architecturally it makes sense. I like the unified and centralized management capabilities, the dynamic site-to-site encryption, et cetera, and I drank the Kool-Aid. But how do I get it? Well, it's quite simply, there's basically three different ways for you to consume SD-WAN. Now, I'm generalizing them here, but it's either do it yourself, a cloud-based model, or go managed. Cloud sits in between both DIY as well as managed. DIY is self-explanatory here in a sense, right? You buy it through a VAR, you get it through a reseller, you work directly with the SD-WAN vendor. Here, very simply, design, implement, operate is all done by you. Cloud, you can actually get some infrastructure and have it hosted by somebody else, whether a service provider or the actual vendor themselves. And typically, not always, typically it is a do-it-yourself scenario. Right, so you're still managing policies, you still got to worry about appliance management and things. We'll get some more detail here in the next slide. And obviously manage, you go through provider, and functionally they handle design, implement, as well as operate services. So there's really three ways to consume this, right? I want to do it myself, I get it through cloud, which is kind of a hybrid, and then I go managed. So you'll be able to view this a little bit better in the offline copy, but I'll go through some of the bullets here, right? So, one of the things you need to do as you're making this decision, I've drank the Kool-Aid, I want to do SD-WAN, I've looked at three different options as far as how to consume it, but reality it's two different options. I want to do it myself or do it yourself, or I want to go manage. So what are some questions to ask yourself, right, to kind of help you think about this decision, right? So we'll just kind of go line by line, right? You need to think about and ask yourself, what kind of expertise do you actually have within your IT organization, right? Do you actually have the personnel? Do you have networking staff? Do you have security staff, right? How large is that organization as it relates to how large your enterprise is, right? Do you have a lot of remote sites? What are your internal expectations and requirements as it relates to security as well as control? And what I mean by that is, I'll give a great example from, a government aspect, right? In a lot of government installations, you need to be certified or authorized in order to control, touch, and actually manage a particular network, right? I mean, we all know the whole secret stuff, right? CIPRNet, NIPRNet, TS, TSSCI, I can go on and go on. But you need to be authorized to touch those, right? And so what are the requirements related to that? That can actually impact your decision. How complex is your integration process? When we talk about this is, truth of the matter is, many of you out there in the world, not everything is new. You have a lot of legacy systems. You have a lot of legacy interfaces. You have a lot of customized applications, databases, various different architectures. And so how complex is that integration process? What's the level of transfer of information you need to do to a third party? Is it okay? Is it going to fit in line with various different project timelines and things? Is your partner capable of being able to do that as it relates to WAN and branch connectivity? What's your sense of urgency to implement, right? How fast you got to go, right? How fast can you go, right? Which relates to the other three topics that we just brought up. What's the level of flexibility that you need internally as it relates to service selection, vendor selection, as well as your overall solution, right? Do you need to have a multi-vendor environment where you have direct control over who you select for each specific appliance, service, function, right? Or are you just looking for an overall service? Do you have any country or local regulations or policies that you need to adhere to that may potentially impact third-party services? So an example from this could be unions, right? If you're in a place where you actually have unions, that can actually impact the utilization of third-party services, right? Because the unions have control over what they need to do. They need to run the cable. They need to actually install the equipment. So how does this impact your overall cost model? These are things you need to think about. And the last one, which seems obvious, is how well are you trained on SD-WAN, right? This kind of relates to the first topic, of course, is related to your IT organization, but if you aren't trained on SD-WAN, then you either need to think about a path of training, or this kind of impacts your decision-making process to, can you do it yourself, or do you want to go manage? Before I move on, Mike, from your point of view, is there any other kind of questions that you think that, from your experience and your customer engagements that, might make sense to help drive a decision between DIY versus a managed solution?
Well, Rob, I think you did a great job in covering the DIY approach and the considerations therein. I would just add that I think it could be very difficult to forecast an SD-WAN project cost given the variety of potential gotchas and unknown soft costs that you mentioned.
That's actually very, very true. And I think, later on we'll touch on a very specific statement I think we'll both jointly make related to what you just said too as well. So I'm gonna go ahead and keep moving on here. So these are just general questions. It's related a little bit, maybe leaning toward DIY, but reality, you ask yourself these, your answer will help dictate which path you want to take. So as we move forward now, okay, so you've answered questions, you said, I'm going to do it myself. Well, now what does this mean? Well, first, let's understand what are the responsibilities that are now underneath your purview as an organization. So you're responsible for the CPE, right, your customer premises equipment. You're responsible for the management of that infrastructure as well as the CPEs of those infrastructure. So depending on the scale and the size of your organization, that could be fairly huge, right? If you aren't doing anything else but DIY today, then it could be business as usual and you understand this. Security. Depending on the SD-WAN solution or the solution services that you're going down, you're going to have to actually figure out how are you going to tie in your security. How are you going to deploy or manage your unified threat management? Looking at antivirus, secure web gateways, malware, all those things that fit within that tier. There's a lot of different options, and if you're doing it yourself, are you working with an SD-WAN vendor that has all those services integrated, or are you now looking at a multi-vendor approach, to which case you've now complicated procurement further, right? You now have multiple contracts with the SD-WAN person, potentially the hardware appliance person. You now have the contracts with your service providers, multiple service providers if you're looking at it from a diversity perspective, your security vendors, and so on and so forth, right? Just be aware, of course, that this is now underneath your responsibility and purview. You're responsible for design implementation. Do you have the skill set to actually design an SD-WAN architecture? Do you have the skills to actually implement that? You got responsibility for ongoing change control, right? Things aren't necessarily a set and forget and let it run. Outage management, detection, resolution, right? Your day-to-day job. Stuff breaks, but obviously you need to be able to manage that, detect it, and then obviously resolve it, right? No one else is doing it for you. And of course, your ongoing day-to-day hardware and software maintenance, software code upgrades, patches, lifecycle management functionally, right? So these are all things that you're responsible for as an IT organization if you decide to do it yourself. So what does that mean in relation to preparing yourself for this? So SD-WAN is a new technology. It's obviously serving the branch connectivity services market. So we've been doing WAN connectivity for years, but obviously it does it a little bit differently. So you obviously want to do your due diligence. You want to prepare if you make this decision to actually do it yourself. So first one's first. The obvious one is test, test, test. Work with your vendor, do your evaluations between the various different SD-WAN providers and test, 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 right? Bring them into the lab, do proof of concepts. Ensure you understand what the solution provides to you, right? And what the solution doesn't do. Then you need to train your staff, right? Your staff needs to understand how to implement SD-WAN. We all talk about it from an industry perspective that we add a level of simplicity associated to how SD-WAN kind of drives WAN connectivity, right? Unified management, a singular centralized console. But as you go through your test process, you'll realize there's a lot underneath the hood that you need to understand and do. You need to understand how to, define application policies, traffic steering policies. What do you do from a device perspective? Templatization, right? Your provisioning process, your alarm management, integration to existing tool sets you have, right? There's a lot that you need to understand and train your staff for, which then leads to the third one, which is arguably probably one of the most important ones, really. Through this, you need to ensure you define a very clear blueprint for your entire network. There's a lot of customers and teams that will identify, yes, we have a kind of a pseudo-standard or blueprint of how we think we want our WAN to operate. But you know what, when you start digging down, you start defining, a lot of inconsistencies in configurations and policies, hardware, appliances, and such, right? But here with SD-WAN, you have the value of templatization and unification, right? And ubiquity across the board on how you want your WAN to operate and the policies defined. But that really is driven from a clear blueprint that you define in the beginning, your provisioning process, what your application policies are, right? What services you want, how are you going to do service chaining, what's the level of segmentation, how you want to actually segment, right? What are your compliance rules? What's your breakout options as it relates to DIA or direct internet access, MPLS, VPN connectivity, etc. Through this process, you've defined use cases that you're going to run with. Don't deviate from them, right? Exercise them in detail. Don't be wishy-washy about what the use case is and what SD-WAN is going to do for you as you define that. Make sure you understand and talk to your transport and provider, your transport provider, and what the options are. Everyone, obviously has connectivity. They deal with multiple last mile providers. You deal with some of the tier ones. But you may not have all the ubiquitous types of options at every single site. So you need to make sure that you understand what your transport connectivity options are and how that actually affects your management of it, contracts, policies, appliance type, and services that you need to do. right? You know, and the last two really point to really more operational stuff, right? I'll use a term from a well-known provider, right? A method of operations, or they like to call it MOP, right? What this really talks to is ensure you're being consistent, right? Make sure you have a very clearly documented or clearly understood method of operations on how you deploy appliances, the policies and templates associated to those, the application policies that relate to the various different departments, groups, organizations, users, partners, and guests, and basically unify and ensure that there's a level of standardization across that, which is driven from a clear defined method of operations of how you actually operate by. And then the last one, of course, is understand actually what the behavior of your applications and your various different cloud connectivity requirements are. Some customers and teams don't necessarily understand the impact, for example, that a SaaS application may have on branch, right, on the WAN, right? An example could be whether it's like Google Drive, right? Give a direct example from a Versa perspective, right? We use Google Drive for some things, and you know, if everyone's syncing the entire shared directory, that's a lot of bandwidth that actually gets utilized on the WAN. So if you aren't actually understanding the behavior of the application and then the defining clear policies to train the behavior of the application, you could actually impact your WAN negatively. As we move forward, and before I kick it over to Mike, I want a quick run through of a case study of ours. This is a top U.S. bank, and interesting enough for these guys, you know, they weren't necessarily trying to reduce WAN costs, right? Their whole purpose of looking at SD-WAN was really to drive a programmatic and automated-based infrastructure, right? They want to utilize SD-WAN in order to achieve that vision, right? Because they weren't able to automate how they were actually doing deployments. They weren't able to automate their compliance changes, right? There was no automation as it relates to their overall branch and WAN estate management, right? Of course, you know, being where they were, you know, they'd have some insufficient bandwidth to address some modern apps, specifically more video-oriented and voice conferencing types of services. And as a result of the lack of automation, they really had a long time in how they were, you know, putting things into service, your MTTS, and then they had a very long time to repair, right? Outages happened. It took them a long time to actually get technicians on site or actually even figure out and get visibility into what the problem was. So Versa was a solution they selected after a lengthy proof of concept and evaluation process. We were able to unify their overall WAN and branch estate policy management through a unified console and centralized management. We began to automate how they were provisioning all of their new sites, their existing branches and cafes, as well as various different things related to compliance. For financial services and security, they began to automate that as a result of the inherent automation in Versa's tools. And then they were able to go to an active-active hybrid WAN, increasing their overall site resiliency 4x, reducing their OpEx by 50% as a result of appliance consolidation, and then be able to drive 100% automated infrastructure for their estate. With that, I want to kick it over to you, Mike, and you know, have you talk about managed SD-WAN.
Thanks, Rob. So whether you subscribe to Nielsen's law or Moore's law, the need for internet bandwidth essentially doubles every 18 months, and network performance expectations increase even more dramatically. The knee-jerk reaction has typically been to throw more bandwidth at it or build another network. It's our contention that you should utilize that bandwidth more effectively, more efficiently by implementing an SD-WAN solution. And typically our managed SD-WAN customers see a reduction in their cost per megabit by 40 to 70%. This is accomplished in a few ways, Rob. First, we can use a number of more cost-effective access types depending on availability and business need. And secondly, by converging the routing of voice data and other mission-critical applications across the network, we can maintain application performance and network health based on pre-established parameters. Second two bullets kind of go hand in hand, single vendor for circuit Versa and security, infrastructure optimization and management. So whether a customer has their own transport in place or chooses to go with SNET for their bandwidth, we can manage that bandwidth to ensure that it is being used in the most effective, efficient way through the policies that we've built into their SD-WAN solution to ensure application performance. Our customers are paired with dedicated project managers and network engineers that work closely with them to design the solution based on best practices and processes we have established through our Versa experience. We handle all sourcing, provisioning, and installation of the equipment, including the logistics for remote location installations, to provide a no-touch or in some cases a very low-touch experience. Lastly, on this slide, we continuously monitor the health of the network and the application performance against predetermined SLAs that we've mutually developed and proactively suggest adjustments to those policies to ensure that the full benefit of the SD-WAN deployment is recognized. And the next slide. These next 4 points kind of relate to simplified network management. So working with SNET reduces the burden of the IT staff throughout the process by taking a white glove approach. Every customer is different, right? So we try to make consuming SD-WAN as easy as possible. We can provide full management of the equipment that includes sourcing, provisioning, and ongoing management. And we can take the same approach to all the transport depending on the needs of the customer. And if they did bring their own bandwidth, we can still monitor and manage those connections, including working with the carrier to resolve issues if we see any hiccups along the way. And lastly, because the Versa gear is fully managed by us, any upgrades, updates are the responsibility of SNET. And if an appliance were to fail, we would be responsible for provisioning and replacing it. And now I'll go into a little detail about a case study that we recently put together. So these are the highlights of a case study about a dental practice we recently worked with to deploy SD-WAN with next generation firewall, cloud PBX for all their offices, and cloud contact center. So this customer was struggling with vendor management across the practice because they have multiple locations throughout Chicagoland and the Southwest United States. They had a variety of providers and even more access types that had to be wrangled in. The challenge was that the network didn't support the high volume of bandwidth that these intense EMR files and images needed to focus or to function appropriately. Additionally, their PBX couldn't support the high volume of calls they needed to provide patient experience or outcomes they desired. If memory serves, I think it was 80 agents handling approximately 15,000 calls a day. And lastly, they couldn't open or support new offices as quickly as they wanted. They had very robust growth plans, and they were looking under their old model at anywhere between 180 to 9 months to open a new office. And as you can see, some of the highlights based on our deployment. So what we did was we deployed SD-WAN with next generation firewall across the practice. We provided our comprehensive voice solution, including cloud contact center, and took over all vendor management for the circuits. And as I suggested here, you can see some of the outcomes as a result of working with SNET. I should also mention that this full deployment from signature to implementation was right around 30 days. So again, we centralized the management of all their access types and infrastructure. We reduced the maintenance and support costs by nearly 40%. We doubled the bandwidth at each location, essentially by deploying SD-WAN and utilizing that bandwidth more effectively. And we improved the reliability across their enterprise by utilizing a dual access methodology in our implementation. Their security measures and office opening parameters were all established and all automated, making their time to open offices drastically reduced from the 180 days that I mentioned earlier to right around 30 days. And at that point, I'll turn it over to you, Rob.
Thanks, Mike. That's pretty awesome. So, you know, from what I was talking about from a DIY angle, right, I think I obviously gave a potential assessment that everything that a organization needs to take into consideration obviously takes a lot of time. And coming from your end, from a managed aspect, of course, you know, those are already predefined, right? You guys already have, you know, whether it's, you know, from SNET or just in general, you know, folks that do what you do, you have blueprints, you have, let's call them recipes or cookbooks on, this is what we do to deploy a practice, right? And so you want this service, here you go, we've got it done, right? And I think that's really awesome from this joint customer of ours that, you were able to get their whole entire plan, right, accomplished in 30 days, right? I think that's actually pretty phenomenal.
Yeah, I think a lot of that, Rob, can be attributed to the templates that we've built based on specific verticals, right? So whether it's a dentist's office, a group of orthopedists, or a gastroenterologist, again, a medical practice is a medical practice, and although they have some individual concerns based on the patients that they see, typically their business models are often very similar.
Right, and what it also talks to is the fact that you've got the as a managed provider, you've got the experience at this, right? So talking to the point of what I was bringing about earlier about training staff and things, you're already trained, right? So you can hit the ground running hard, and you've already got best practices already put in place to understand what to do about branch connectivity and even potentially integrating it like you did for this customer from a UC and voice perspective. Before we conclude here, I just want to add a couple of points, right? We do have a couple of questions, Mike, right? And a few of them are here for you that I can see at the moment. But before we hit the questions, let everybody understand, we do have attachments. Download them, copy of the presentation, case study also available for our viewers, as well as a quick at-a-glance document related to who SNET is and what they can actually provide. You can see the links here. If you want more information, you can contact me directly, rob@versa-networks.com, or you can contact us at versa@info, and one of our sales experts and technical experts can get back to you depending on the nature of your question. You can contact Mike directly in the email address located here, and obviously our Bright Tech channel as we continue to keep doing this webinar series. So with that, Mike, I got one question here I want to ask you that I've got. Let's see here. Let's pick this one first. Can you give a quick summary on the impact you've seen for hosted unified communication services on the WAN? And basically, I think what they're asking is there a measurable impact by deploying SD-WAN and bundling with your voice services?
Yeah, so, one of the most sensitive applications anyone runs over the WAN is voice. And typically that's one of the biggest hurdles to rolling out voice over the wide area network is the impact or the unknown impact that it's going to have on wide area network and other applications, mission critical applications running over the wide area network. With the SD-WAN solution, again, we're able to set the policies to determine traffic flow and traffic prioritization so that voice traffic, voice quality is guaranteed and application performance continues to function within the parameters set forth in the policies mutually developed. So we see it going part and parcel, right? So a lot of times if someone's contemplating hosted voice and their biggest gotcha or their biggest hurdle or obstacle is, well, I'm unsure if this is going to work, I need 100% uptime. Well, a lot of times we'll steal from Peter to pay for Paul. In other words, we'll reduce the we'll reduce the hosted voice cost to accomplish or to be able to put in an SD-WAN box to ensure that that customer is getting the quality of service that they demand and the 100% uptime that their enterprise requires.
Awesome. I got one question I want to flip over to you, and then still going through a few of them here. We're not going to get through all of them, but this one's interesting actually, right? So you and I both talked about two different modes of consumption. We try to give, I think we gave a fairly comprehensive highlight as far as things to consider, things of value that one receives as one or the other path. So this one I'm going to flip to you actually, right? Because I think it's more strongly the answer will come from you is cost-wise. Can you give a general assessment on the cost differences between managed and DIY? And I think what this is I've heard this too, is do-it-yourself cheaper?
Right. So, Rob, that's the million-dollar question. So, from my experience, it seems as though it can be. But that's if the project is properly scoped based on the considerations you mentioned earlier in this presentation. And that's also assuming they have the human resource and the knowledge along the way. Otherwise, unforeseen costs and delays can blow up the project budget. With SNET, our turnkey solution, all costs are pre-negotiated via the contract and time frames set, so there are no surprises along the way. Because as we know, time is money, and missed deadlines can certainly add to the cost of a project.
Yeah, I would highlight that part, right? The soft costs are difficult to pre-assess, right? I know of some customer deployments, kind of add to your answer here, is, they did it themselves, but they recognized that mid-deployment, they wanted to change the architecture out because they wanted it fit better in line with a potential application architecture they had, right? So they went from initial design to, we actually want to change it because we got something else going on. And so this kind of in-line change, right, impacts costs, right, because it drives deployment time, it adjusts scheduling, and it redirects resources, right? And so, those are things that are hard to predict, right? So it's very difficult to just blatantly state, if I do it myself, it is cheaper, right? Because I manage everything, I negotiate my own contracts for each vendor, et cetera, but there's a lot of unforeseen and unseen things, and a lot of variables that impact. And, obviously from your point, as you clearly stated, of course, is that going through a managed provider, it's agreed upon beforehand, and there's no surprises.
That's right.
So with that, we're coming up on the end of our webinar here. The idea of DIY versus managed, I hope that we gave the audience here a food for thought, right? I hope you walked away with understanding these are things I need to consider if I want to do it yourself or managed. We also gave you an option here. Thank you, Mike, for joining us today, right? I'll actually ask this question because it's pertinent to your business. Is are you only continentally U.S. based, or are you guys expanding internationally, right? Because I know some of our audience members are actually not just here in the U.S., they're actually internationally. So if they're interested in potentially reaching out to you, do you guys have business or plans to do business outside of here?
Yeah, so that's a great question. I'm glad you asked it. So we've actually deployed SD-WAN internally for one of our own remote international locations. And it handles, again, not only our cloud-based PBX internally for our own organization, but also our cloud contact center application for some of our support mechanisms within SNET. We also have a number of opportunities in the works right now, and suspect that we will be closing on some of them before the end of this year and deploying internationally for our customers early 2018.
Awesome. So not only are you U.S. based, but it sounds to me like what you just stated, that there's growth on the horizon for you guys, which is awesome, right? So that means that, look, you guys are expanding outside. You got some points of presences or abilities to deploy internationally for some of those that may be interested. And with that, Mike, I really appreciate you joining me today and giving SNET Communications perspective as it relates to managed services. And obviously, you guys have been a great partner of ours. And I appreciate everyone who's joined us today on this webinar. A couple of reminders: please rate the presentation. Attachments are available to you. Copy of the presentation is also there for you, as well as join our webinar series and our channel on Bright Talk. If you have any questions after this webinar, by all means, please reach out to us directly, or you can actually utilize the Bright Talk platform, and we'll actually receive them and be able to answer appropriately. And with that, thank you, Mike, and thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Rob.